What's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I try and help you guys keep on top of the world's #2 economy. My name is Tony. That clip that you just saw was a propaganda video that was released by the People's Liberation Eastern Command. It's a music video on Tuesday. I thought it was probably relevant to start this episode with that video, that piece of propaganda from earlier in the week, because of everything that we're seeing in the region at the moment. Of course, the cross-strait relationship between the mainland and Taiwan is incredibly tense at the moment. South China Sea has seen a jump in militarization, and of course there's a very concerning standoff on the Indian-Chinese border. So I thought, let's just start with that. For those of you watching for the first time on this channel, we discuss geopolitical, political, military, and economic developments on a week-to-week basis, based on a sober analysis of the facts as we understand them. So if that's something you might be interested in and you want to be as informed about this stuff as my clients are, then maybe consider subscribing. For everyone else, it's good to see you. We're going to be talking about the economy this week. We're going to be starting with the economy, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Then we're going to look at this incredible showdown at the United Nations earlier this week between Trump and Xi. Two different speeches when both were targeting each other in different ways. There's a few other smaller stories we're going to touch on, and then we're going to end with a new report that came out on Thursday from an Australian think tank about the situation in Xinjiang. That's how we're going to end the episode. As always, guys, if you enjoyed the episode, it's a massive help if you smash the like button. Unfortunately, the content is not promoted by YouTube because apparently it's too sensitive. And if you want to support the channel more than that, there's my Patreon below, and I appreciate any support I get from that. So cheers from you guys again. If you want to see the episode from 2 days ago when we talked about Taiwan and WeChat, just click up here. Otherwise, let's jump into this week's China Update. So I want to start with a story about Evergrande real estate group in China. I'm going to put a video to the back of this because these sort of stories just make me think about people partying in a club for some reason. So I'm going to put this up from last Friday, a nice Chinese club here. Some people listen to some alternative rock. Evergrande Real Estate Group is China's second largest property developer by sales and the most indebted developer in the world. With over $120 billion of debt, its debt is equivalent to the entire GDP of the Ukraine. It is also likely seen as a too big to fail developer by Beijing. And as you guys know, those of you who have been watching for some time, the property market is a particular vulnerability in the People's Republic of China. So this too big to fail developer, why are we talking about it? Well, it may be in a bit of trouble. Shanghai Stock Exchange suspended trading with Evergrande bonds for half an hour this morning after reports that it was seeking government help to stave off a cash crunch or a credit crunch, reports that the company strongly denies. Reports allege that in a private letter to government officials in southern Guangdong, the company warned that without sufficient government support, the economy faced, quote, systemic risks, end quote, without specifying what those were. So this is quite recent news, and it's hard to know what exactly is happening here, whether the government's going to step in and nothing's going to come of it, or whether this is going to transform into a big national issue. It's being talked about all over WeChat today, guys. If it does develop into something more relevant to a national story, we're going to be talking about it more in depth next week, but I just wanted to give you guys a heads up because I do think this is going to be a relevant story. Okay, moving on to what we had in my thumbnail for this episode, the UN. So on Tuesday at the annual United Nations General Assembly, they had a meeting, and boy, were there fireworks between the US and China. US President Donald Trump called out China for its role in the coronavirus pandemic and demanded that United Nations hold China accountable, saying, quote, China unleashed this plague onto the world, end quote, and that the World Health Organization is, quote, virtually controlled by China, end quote. Well, Trump's speech certainly hit a nerve within China and within the Chinese government apparatus. The next day, Zhang Jun, China's ambassador to the United Nations, said the US had, quote, abused the organization's platform to spread groundless accusations, end quote, and that while China was, quote, open, transparent, and responsible, end quote, during the outbreak, the US was a, quote, complete failure, end quote. The same day, Foreign Ministry spokesperson Wang Wenbin said, quote, we urge the US to stop playing political games, abandon unilateralism, and live up to its due responsibility to the world, end quote. The People's Daily wrote that Trump is, quote, blindly staging a farce of self-isolation, hatred, and xenophobia, end quote. And lastly, the state-run Xinhua media wrote, quote, the US leader made groundless accusations on the handling of the COVID-19 pandemic and other unprovoked accusations against China and spread the political virus wantonly. This kind of hysterical behavior that uses every opportunity to smear China has abused and tarnished the UN platform, making the world laugh, end quote. Like I said, the speech really hit a nerve. Now, let's go back to Tuesday and look at what General Secretary Xi Jinping said. The General Secretary was more diplomatic in his language and seemed to be saying what he thought the people would like to hear, but he still took aim at the US with some of the language that he employed. He framed the virus as everybody's challenge and lauded China's response, saying, quote, any attempt to politicize or stigmatize this issue must be rejected, end quote. General Secretary Xi also tried to present China as a responsible stakeholder and an alternative to the United States. He is likely also trying to convince the EU and others not to side with the US against China. We can see several statements and promises that are likely for a European audience. For example, quote, we aim to have CO2 emissions peak before 2030 and achieve carbon neutrality before 2060, end quote. This was indeed all throughout the Western press after he made these statements. This is, of course, an endorsement of one of the EU's so-called 3 demands, and many are happy to hear it. However, the timing of the announcement is interesting, to say the least, and the Chinese leadership does have a reputation over the years to make promises to an international audience that want to hear them, but then not living up to them in the years following the promise. A very interesting detail also with this event, Xi Jinping was identified for the general debate session as 殿下习近平. 殿下means His Highness Xi Jinping, which is often used for emperors and monarchs. 殿 means literally like palace or palace hall, whereas other heads of states that were not monarchs, for example, the president of the US, Donald Trump, is identified as 阁下, 阁下, which is more like His Excellency. In his opening remarks on Tuesday, the UN Secretary General warned that due to the US-China tensions, the world was, quote, moving in a very dangerous direction, end quote. Okay, next up, let's talk about the economy. A lot of official numbers have come out this week, which are looking pretty promising for the economy. Like all official numbers, we just have to be aware that these are coming from the central government. So we're going to go through the good, a little bit of the bad, and then we're going to turn to the ugly with a very comprehensive report that I'd highly recommend reading. I'll have the link below shortly. I'll tell you guys about that shortly. That looks at credit stress, financial systemic stress within the Chinese economy. Let's go through some of these one at a time though. So the good. Retail sales in August were up 0.5% from a year earlier, the first month of growth in 2020. Car sales in China were up 6% in August. Developers saw a 30.7% increase in home sales in August. Official urban unemployment is down to 5.6%, the lowest since January of this year. Exports are up in August, beating expectations, seeing a 9.5% rise from a year ago. Now, not all of it is rosy, obviously. Online sales of consumer goods and services grew by 13.3% in August, slower than 18.8% in July, and down from 19% in June. This was lower than expectations. Now, most of this does sound like good news, but with all the seemingly good news in mind, this week the Center for Strategic and International Studies released a 100-page report entitled, quote, The China Economic Risk Matrix. I've put the link below for anyone who wants to read the full report. It's very dry, but I think it's very, very interesting. Well worth a read. I just want to quote a couple of parts from the report and some of its conclusions here. The report says, quote, at a time when China's economy is recovering much faster than the rest of the world from the COVID-19 outbreak, it may seem counterintuitive to start talking about systemic risks in China rather than those in other economies. But the same factors that facilitated that rapid recovery, a high degree of state control, directed flows of credit, and a high level of domestic policy credibility, are also among the factors that are now pushing China's financial system deep into a gauntlet of systemic risk. Economic growth has been facilitated by the largest single country credit expansion in over a century. It goes on to conclude, quote, "This narrative of China's inexorable rise can and should be challenged. Despite China's strong record of economic growth over the past 2 decades, even following the COVID-19 outbreak, growth in China continues to depend upon increasingly inefficient state-led and bank-financed investment. Facts on the ground in China's financial system suggest that the economy is more vulnerable to financial stress than is commonly assumed. As financial risks become more apparent following a decade of rapid credit growth and the shock of the COVID-19 outbreak, China's potential growth and productivity growth are slowing. Demographic changes mean a shrinking labor force in the coming decade. Productivity has been hampered by a financial system that continues to keep bloated state-owned enterprises and local government firms afloat with new loans rather than channeling credit to the more productive private sector." End quote. And I also want to stress this line in particular because it's something that I strongly believe is an accurate characterization. Quote, "China's internal risks are far more acute than the external risks at this point, even though China faces a far more hostile external environment." End quote. The director and secretary of the party branch of the Department of Infectious Diseases at Huashan Hospital, Shanghai, Zhang Wenhong, in an interview with China-based private media company Caixin Media, expressed concerns that this winter a second wave in China would be, quote-unquote, inevitable. Quote, "Given the structure of the Chinese political system, we need to adopt a strategy of complete quarantine in the event of a flare-up. The key to the strategy is to succeed in containing any flare-up within 1 month. Otherwise, those flare-ups will grow exponentially. Right now, China is still at risk from imported cases. Based on the available facts, the new COVID virus will last for a very long time. Up to 80% of COVID-19 infections are asymptomatic, which poses a huge risk to vulnerable groups." End quote. It is being reported in the state media that the central government has sent teams led by senior officials to each province to inspect their readiness in responding to a second wave as we move into winter this year. And lastly, guys, let's talk about Xinjiang. The well-respected Australian Strategic Policy Institute, ASPI, published another report on the grave situation in Xinjiang this week, which has been widely covered in Western media. You may have seen it in the media already. Chinese government commentators argue that the institute produces biased anti-China American propaganda due to the fact that they receive funds from the US government. It's worth noting at this point that is true. It does receive funding from the US government. We should also note, however, that Australia is a close military and intelligence ally of the United States. Anticipating this criticism from Beijing, the ASPI also released the raw data used in the report in the interests of transparency and public scrutiny. The report, which was published on Thursday of this week, challenges the Chinese government's claims that the detention camps in Xinjiang, facilities that Beijing calls vacational training centers only, have been decreasing in volume. The report argues that the detention sites have actually been expanding, with many detainees likely being sent to regular prisons and perhaps other facilities. Unsurprisingly, Beijing strongly rejects the report. When asked by a Bloomberg reporter about the report, Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Wang Wenbin stated, quote, "There was never any detention camp in Xinjiang. As to the fact-distorting reports on China churned out by the ASPI, we have responded repeatedly. As revealed by sources in Australia, this institute has long been receiving funds from the US government and arms dealers. Its passion lies in concocting and sensationalizing anti-China topics imbued with ideological prejudice. It is practically an anti-China vanguard whose academic integrity is in serious question. The ASPI has come under wide criticism for what it has done and stands as a laughingstock in the world. We hope and trust that people will all see through and reject the ludicrous findings of such anti-China organizations." End quote. Okay guys, that is our episode for today. I'm really interested to hearing what your guys' feedback is regarding the length. What I've been trying to do is break this into 2 episodes a week and try and keep them under 15 minutes. I'm not sure what you guys think about that, whether you like to have more content, whether you like to have a shorter one in the middle of the week, a long one at the end of the week. I actually cut several stories out of this episode to try and make them shorter. So let me know what you think in the comments below. I really appreciate your feedback. As always, this is still a growing channel, so I really need that feedback. But at any rate, I hope you guys did enjoy this episode nonetheless. I'm looking forward to discussing some of these topics with you guys below. I hope you have a great weekend, and until next time, stay safe and stay sane. I'll see you next time on China Update.